So Josh, can you start the recording?
It's on its way.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Delnau. I am the State Librarian of Vermont and the chair of the working group on the status of libraries in Vermont. Today is Friday, April 21st, 2023, and I'm calling this meeting of the working group on the topic of intellectual freedom to order at 9:01 a.m. A note for everyone on the call. This meeting is being recorded and the video will be posted to the working group's webpage next week. The state is having some issues with the website right now that I believe are out of the state's control. And so we haven't been able to post everything to the website in advance of the meeting today. But rest assured, we'll get that information up as soon as we can. We have a full agenda today with a number of guest presenters and community members lined up to share with us on the important topic of intellectual freedom. This topic ties in with at least 3 areas of the working group's charge of study, specifically programming, collections, and technology. Our agenda today will start off with a number of presentations from experts in the field, both Vermont experts and national experts, and we'll also have a report from the Department of Library staff on collections. This report is scheduled today because collections are very relevant to the topic of intellectual freedom. And when the working group heard about collections originally, it was prior to the introduction of departmental reports to our agendas. So our team has we did a little bit of a catch up on collections, and that's why it's folded in today. So that will be the morning half of things from 9 to 12. And then we'll do our lunch recess starting at 12 and finishing at 1. And then we'll move into oral comments from the community. The final activity of the day will be a discussion by the working group. In light of the many people that we are hearing from today and the addition of an hour to our already packed regular schedule, I did not build in specific 15-minute breaks into today's agenda. So working group members, I'm counting on you to take care of yourselves by going off camera and stretching, using the facilities, taking brief breaks throughout the day. Please try to do that in a staggered fashion so that we're not all away at the point where someone is done providing their comments and it's time for questions. Does that sound agreeable to everyone? I see some nods and a thumbs up, so that's good. Okay, I'm going to move on to roll call. There are a few folks who are out today or who will be joining us later. So when we go through the alphabetic roll call of the working group members, I'll just make note of those. Meg Allison has an excused absence today. Maria Avery.
I am here. Good morning.
Good morning, Maria. Jeanette Bear.
I'm here.
Great. Denise Hersey is going to join us around 9:30. Christopher Kaufman-Ilstrup.
Here.
Andy Kolovos.
Here.
Kelly McCagg.
Yes, I am here.
Great. Karen is excused today. Susan O'Connell.
I'm here at the moment, but will be very intermittent today.
Okay, thank you. And Susan had mentioned that to me previously. And then Wendy Sharkey.
I'm here.
Great. So that's all of our members of the working group. We have a quorum, which is wonderful that so many can be here. Any of the members who are missing today's meeting will be able to review the video of it. So they'll be all caught up to speed. I now want to just have the department staff who are here let us know that they're here. I'll call people by name just for the interest of time. Tom McMurdo.
Good morning, everyone.
Jeanette Schaefer.
Good morning.
Josh Muse is on our technology support.
Morning, everyone.
April Shaw.
Good morning.
Lauren Kelly.
Good morning.
Karen Gravlin,
Good morning.
Joy Warland,
Good morning.
Jonathan Clark,
Good morning, everybody.
Lily Talbert,
Morning.
and I think last and certainly not least, because Gina is our fearless minute taker, Gina Rubin.
Hello, good morning.
Thanks, Gina. While Gina's on screen, let me just mention to working group members, if you ever need to communicate with me about an absence or something that I really need to see in a timely way, please CC Gina so that she can help to wrangle things, because my schedule's a little bit zooey sometimes. So don't forget to include Gina on those communications if you need anything. And also working group members who are getting per diem reimbursements, if you're requesting those, please be sure to send those to Gina. Are there any other members of the Department of Library staff who are here today who I missed in roll call? Great. And then I believe we actually have, we may have somebody else with us. I think that our first presenter, John Kratzka from Every Library, is here right now as well.
Good morning, everybody. I'm looking forward to being with you today.
Great to see you, John. Is there anyone else, members of the public or library community, is there anybody else who's here, just so that we make note of you? Okay. So not hearing from anyone else, let's move on to the approval of the minutes of our working group meeting on March 24th, 2023. As usual, Gina got these up online within 5 days, and it's 5 calendar days. So these have been up for a while, and I hope that working group members have had the opportunity to review them. And we have the possible action of approving them. I think if we could get somebody to make a motion to approve them and then a second, then we can discuss them and then we can do a vote.
This is Kelly. I'll make a motion to approve.
Thanks,
Christopher
Gina.
will second.
Great. Okay, let's open it up for discussion of any revisions. Are they perfect?
Absolutely.
For the minutes of this meeting, I think we need that exchange. Are they perfect? Absolutely. Okay, I'm not hearing anything. Shall I call a vote?
Yep.
Let's do it. All right, all in favor of approving Gina Rubin's amazing minutes of our working group meeting on Friday, March 24th, 2023, please say aye.
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 All opposed, please say nay. All right, the minutes have been unanimously approved. That was the smoothest ever. I can't spell unanimous. I have stacks of paper here at my desk getting sorted. Okay, well, let's move into, we're a little just fine because our first presenter is here. Let's move to the public comment. And this is the period of time when somebody not on the agenda and not in the working group, or somebody on the agenda who also wants to say something. This is the space we reserve for the public to share their comments. Oh, there's somebody here. If you're just joining us, and I think Veronica may be just joining us, and I think that's Veronica, the library director from Chelsea.
Yes, that's me. Hi, everyone.
Hi, Veronica, you've arrived as if on cue. I had just opened up public comment. Did you have anything you wanted to share, or are you just here to observe today?
Just here to observe, although we did have a book challenge. And I couldn't seem to get to the website, like it wouldn't load, so I couldn't get to this link. So Lily forwarded it to me, just in case other people are having the issue.
Yeah, actually, Veronica, that's a really great point. Lily, could you email the whole library community and let them know that the state of Vermont is having some website issues, and just to share the link with them via email, because they'll be able to get to the Teams meeting. But Veronica, that's a really key point. If you weren't able to get in and took that avenue, we should proactively push that out to people.
I think Josh already took care of that, actually. Thanks,
Oh my
Josh.
gosh. Apparently, oh, well, wonderful.
Just a few
Okay.
minutes ago. So
Okay, so Lily, you don't need to do that. And Veronica, thank you for letting us know about it. And sounds like Josh is on it, which I shouldn't be surprised by, I guess. Okay. Is there any other comment from members of the public? Okay. Well, John Kratska, you're here. Would you like to begin your presentation a little bit early?
I'm always available for call of the chair. Happy to. So,
Wonderful.
yeah.
Well, let me just welcome you here today, John. Thank you so much for being here with us. John Kraska is the executive director and the founder of Every Library, and I know that many folks on this call are familiar with Every Library. And I'm going to turn it over to John. He's got a presentation that will be posted on the working group's website. And John, please take us through your presentation. And as we discussed earlier, we've scheduled you for a 30-minute presentation. In light of the fact that we're a little ahead of schedule, we could go a little bit longer and finish up by 10 a.m. So we'll hear from John, and then we'll have an opportunity to ask questions. So working group members, please hold your questions for John. And I will turn it over to you now.
That's great. I have to ask the Zoom era question. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yes,
Okay,
I can.
great. Thank you very much. So I have about 20 minutes of content, and then very happy to engage the discussion. Hi, everybody. I'm John Kraska, Executive Director for Every Library and the Every Library Institute. It's a real pleasure to be speaking with the working group today. I appreciate the invitation. Every Library, excuse me, the Every Library Institute is our nonprofit side. Some of you might be familiar with our Political Action Committee, and I have materials here in the slide about our work on the political side. But we're really visiting with you today from our nonprofit public policy, tax policy, education policy think tank. We're spending a lot of time right now, tactically as well as strategically, on these conversations about the right to read, but also the broader framework of rights that we have in this country. The impact of book bans and challenges on collection development, the impact of book bans and challenges on the conduct of the business of libraries as public entities. The Every Library Institute itself, as a public policy, tax policy, education policy think tank, is working across many different sectors, including public library funding, the authority of librarians and boards to act, the framework of education policy, as well as the funding formula for education, including school libraries. We've been involved very deeply in the fights this legislative session. Since the spring session started, the winter session in January of 2023, we've seen dozens and dozens of legislative initiatives around the country that are specifically targeting the right to read, the structure of government for libraries, as well as some really pernicious bills intended to criminalize librarians as well as educators, and in some places museum professionals as well. On the ground, on our Every Library Institute side, we've been doing a tremendous amount of monitoring and commentary, including technical assistance for library communities that are looking to oppose legislation or amend legislation. We're spending a tremendous amount of time with local library boards. The chance to have this conversation with you as a state organization very strategically in an environment where there's not as much going on as, say, our colleagues in Idaho or Arkansas or Florida or Texas or several other places is very exciting to me, because what we've seen is a breakdown in not just having policies about intellectual freedom, not just having policies about book challenges, but the nature and structure of those policies specifically. We do also, of course, on our political side, have a lot of on-the-ground work that we're doing, where we're supporting local library alliances, oftentimes inside the library, to hold the line against pernicious attacks, but oftentimes also outside of the library, because we have lost the board of that library. What I want to share with you first is some observations that we have about the way the nature of these challenges on materials are coming in. And there's a significant opportunity, I think, here to learn from other states in other locations who have been experiencing the most weaponized or politicized versions of these attacks. What we know from working with dozens and dozens of libraries on the ground in moments of inoculation against problems or mitigation against crisis, that the at the core of this conversation is the fact that we have a conflict within the rights that are enumerated in the First Amendment. And I'll get into this in a little bit more detail, but I'd like to start this observation with the fact that the right to petition, the right to challenge materials, the right to ask for a review of materials by citizens is a constitutional right that is co-equal to the freedom of speech issues in the First Amendment. There are 5 freedoms in the First Amendment, freedom of speech being one of them, but the right to petition your government for redress of grievances is a constitutional co-equal right with the freedom of speech. And the conflicts, the deep conflicts between those two rights are playing out in libraries all across the country. Any petition or challenge process that we're seeing must afford the petitioners their rights, must afford the respect to the legitimacy of that question that they have about what's happening with their government, which is their library, and that the due process rights of all of those petitioners must be respected. Otherwise, you're doing something which is unfortunate, which is violating the First Amendment. It's just a different one of the freedoms. But what we're seeing around the country, and this is the unfortunate part of it, is that many of the book bans and challenges are not coming from a place of what I would consider sincerely held belief or legitimacy. Any particular person who wants to talk to their government about their library, about what the materials are, their school districts, what's in their school library, what's in their public library, I support that 100% because I'm co-equally interested in the freedom of speech and the right to petition. However, many of these book bans and challenges that are happening are coming from a politicized, even weaponized source. They are not intended to be resolved. And that is a difficult thing to confront because we assume in our democracy that if we have an issue, either administrative or legal, that we can have a resolution to it in good order. We are not seeing resolutions being what the interested party is doing. It is intended in many places to break down the regular order. It's intended to put in, we've seen hundreds of book bans being submitted in a cut and paste fashion. They're taken from a national database from some group like Moms for Liberty or another one of the state organizations. And they're submitted with the intent to grind the challenge process to a halt and break, in a certain respect, the structure of the library. Likewise, the petitioners are not always local. We often see folks who are not from the local zip code, the local jurisdiction of the library, coming in and using the petition process in a way that is not a participatory activity. When the petitioner neither respects the outcome of the challenge nor the process itself and does not participate in the policy framework, I think there's some discussion to be had on the part of libraries about whether or not that is a true engagement with the rights of the petitioner under the First Amendment. And if there are ways that the library board or other legislative frameworks can help protect the library as a part of government from something that is called the heckler's veto. The idea that somebody who doesn't like an idea, a policy, a way of life, can come in and shut things down. We need to be engaged, I think, as a library community at the most local level and at the state level about ensuring that the functioning of government, which is our libraries and our school districts, proceeds. Otherwise, the disenfranchisement that happens for every other citizen, every other resident, every other user is pernicious and destructive. We see 5 vectors of attack coming in from the folks who are looking to put in illegitimate charges. And that's a loaded word on my part. I'm coming into you right now from, where I live in suburban Chicago. I'm in Austin, Texas right now. I can say illegitimate in a way that might be impolite. But I don't see a lot of legitimacy to a cut and paste job around book bans and challenges. There's a political action that's taking place on the part of some of these groups. They're looking to build their base. They're coming at this this book ban and censorship vector from an anti-people perspective. It has always been easier in this country to go after the books than it is to go after humans. And yet every stories or stories from communities of color are themselves attacks on people by proxy. We see some traditional anti-government and anti-tax organizations really trying to fuel the activity around these book bans and challenges because it achieves a common goal for them, which is to dismantle tax-based public services. We see anti-education as well as anti-union activities. It's intended to discredit the workforce, to end the idea that the workforce deserves some dignity. And we do see in very significant ways in some communities the spiritual or religious or moral components here being very troublingly active. The separation of church and state, that is a component of the First Amendment as well, that is co-equal to the freedom of speech as well as the right to petition, has to be an area that we as a library community spend more time on. We have been very welcoming. We have been welcoming to a fault of every creed, sect, non-sectarian, but we haven't been necessarily discussing the idea that we are, as a community, in a public-funded governmental setting. And what does it mean to have that wall of separation? One person's morality, one group's morality as a way to set an agenda, that is an area of legitimate concern as well for us out here. It's not just the books, mind you. We're seeing state legislation that is doing several things right now this session and into the 2022 session, particularly legislation that regulates procurement. It's very interesting that they're going after the ability of a state library agency or a education network to purchase something as prosaic as a school library database, because the content in it is what they are concerned with. They're limiting the ability, they're prescribing the ability of support organizations to bring in that kind of content. There's a number of legislative initiatives that are going out right now in the beginning of 2023 to criminalize librarianship and educators. They are modifying, in many of these legislative attempts, longstanding precedents in civil and criminal law about obscenity. And in our country, there are safeguards for nonprofits, for government, for education against pernicious prosecutions and prosecutorial overreach under the criminal code around obscenity. They are in 17 states right now working to put librarians, educators, and in some places museum professionals in the crosshairs of obscenity prosecutions that hasn't been available since in Vermont, 1967. They're also moving obscenity definitions from the criminal code, which are intended to regulate commercial activity as well as private activity. It's the adult bookstores, it's adult movie theaters, it's the magazines behind the counter. They're moving those definitions about sexually explicit into administrative code rather than solely being in the criminal code. The impact of that is unknown right now about the chilling effect on speech. There are legislative limits on, and bans on discussing certain topics, preemption challenges to local policies, reducing state aid for libraries and budgets for state library agencies. Folks, it is a whole cloth approach to going after the structure, again, of the way libraries are constituted, how librarianship is done, how we serve without fear or favor. The 5 freedoms being in conflict right now is something that I would like to suggest this working group needs to pay some attention to from a collection development perspective, but I also understand that in May, you're going to be talking more about the structure of government issues as well. The 5 freedoms being in conflict, so the freedom of speech, if we can all go back to our civics lessons from high school, the 5 freedoms are freedom of speech, the freedom of religion, freedom of the press, freedom of assembly, and again, that right to petition the government for redress. The conflicts within the First Amendment have always been there. In fact, Vermont, your Constitution has a more robust environment, according to many legal commentators, about free speech guarantees that are coexistent with the federal guarantees, and they're operative in the same way as the First Amendment is for libraries. There's some conversations that should be had about whether or not rooting a conversation more deeply in the Vermont constitutional guarantees around freedom of speech, not to the exclusion, of course, of the federal, but there might be an important conversation to be had there. For the five freedoms have always been in conflict. The freedom of speech, which is in conflict with freedom of religion, for example. The right to petition, as we've already discussed, the idea that the right to assemble is core. It's why people come to open meetings like this one or board meetings. I mean, I'm nostalgic for 2020 and 2021, where if anyone had shown up to a board meeting, they would be on the board because they were participating in their government. Now we're seeing situations where those meetings are being used as political platforms. The deep conflicts within the First Amendment are a truly American conversation, but I don't believe that we can resolve the conflicts within the First Amendment by weaponizing or working with the other components of the First Amendment against each other. It just creates more division. It grinds government more to a halt. It creates a situation. We need to figure out the right way to resolve it from a library perspective, especially around collection development. The states are trying to grapple with this right now, and I applaud Vermont for having the working group right now focusing on this. There's a few different models out there that states are trying to do here in early 2023 to unwind the problems within the First Amendment. The petitioning that's going on, the challenges, the book bans. In Illinois, my home state, there is a bill right now, it's HB 2789, it's 2023 session, that is intending to, in shorthand, ban the book bans. It provides that in order to be eligible for state grants, a public library or library system shall develop a written policy prohibiting the practice of banning books within the public library or library system. As written, and I understand that there might have been an amendment introduced yesterday, but I haven't seen the engrossed version yet. But as written, the idea of banning book bans by limiting access to government funding might be itself a First Amendment violation, or at least a due process violation. I'm very eager to see Illinois enshrine better protections for the right to read, but I would like to suggest that it is creating perhaps some additional conflicts that would be only resolvable by the courts. Again, I understand that there might have been an amendment issued yesterday, but I haven't had an opportunity to read the engrossed version. I would sincerely hope that they would look at a framework, though, that is affirmative about rights. In Connecticut right now, there's a bill, SB 2, that is a larger education bill. So when you crack it open, you're going to be like, this isn't about libraries. Yeah, you keep reading it. It allows, in that a certain provision of it, a municipality in Connecticut to designate its principal public library as a sanctuary public library and makes those libraries eligible to receive additional or special library grants. It is interesting to me that in Connecticut, they have a framework where there is a principal public library and then kind of a junior public library. They're looking to create a third type of library by really a very short bill that doesn't necessarily have a larger framework about what it means to be a sanctuary public library, other than the encouragement, again, incentivized by government with grant money. Again, I'm very interested in seeing Connecticut advance that some sort of a framework that's affirmative for the rights of people to read, but also considering case law previously about government using either the carrot or the stick of withholding or giving money. Again, for the Vermont conversation here, it's worth study. Rhode Island, our colleagues in Rhode Island, have a different kind of approach that I think might be a little bit more palatable to the First Amendment, because they're looking at safeguarding the library as an entity in an environment where obscenity and morality is being utilized. The goals of H6066 is to amend the penal code, whereas Illinois and Connecticut are working on library law, to amend the penal code itself, which is where the obscenity criminalization is, to bring it into closer alignment with the Miller test. Rhode Island has not had a very strong, it's one of 6 states historically that had a less enumerative version of the Miller test to determine if materials are obscene, as well as a less enumerative version of defense from prosecution. Now that's particular and peculiar to Rhode Island as well as 5 other states, but this idea that we could potentially be looking at other places of law than the First Amendment, which is deeply in conflict, I think should be inspiring to this conversation. Now, the caveat here is Vermont state statutes on obscenity are already in very substantial compliance with the Miller test. They have been in alignment with it for generations. So the pathway here, well, let me talk about the Miller test for just a moment. The Miller test is the Supreme Court test for determining whether or not an item, a book, a CD, a DVD, a magazine, a photograph, a display of some sort, art, is itself obscene. It relies on the freedom of speech framework within the First Amendment. And I need to emphasize something here for libraries, that the Miller test is the lens in which a publisher, potentially a vendor, certainly a library, looks at whether or not an item is illegal or not, and whether or not it's available, therefore, as protected speech. But this First Amendment framework around the Miller test is not a collection development rubric. I would highly suggest that the Miller test and the First Amendment freedom of speech issues are more about collection retention. Somebody challenges a book and says that this is obscene, and the finders of fact in a court or the administrative processes within a public library reviews it in light of federal and state law. The Miller test and the constitutional protections in Vermont, the statutory protections in Vermont, is the item in question in this book review process. Number 1 on the test, applying contemporary community standards, would we find the work taken as a whole appealing to the prurient interests? And I'm sure as today progresses, you're going to hear about policy frameworks that are we aligning our local library policies and their school policies appropriately to the Miller test. The contemporary community standards conversation within that, the taken as a whole part of it, whether the work depicts or describes in a patently offensive way sexual conduct as defined by applicable state law. And as I mentioned earlier, Vermont statute, which I referenced at the bottom here, is very similar to the Miller test's requirements. And whether the work taken as a whole lacks serious literary, artistic, political, or scientific value. And in Vermont, there's an exemption for education as well. This is not the reason you bring a book into the collection. It's a reason that you would say to a petitioner, this material is not obscene. It does not pass the Miller test. And if it does, we will remove it. This, as a collection development framework, is inadequate. Not just today, but potentially, I mean, my big question around the country right now is, why do we bring the book into the library in the first place? Why did we bring the book into the library in the first place? Because if the only reason to do it is that it's not illegal, that is a very wide collection development policy. There's a framework in K-12 that I think public libraries can learn from. The framework in K-12 about why do you bring a book into the school? And I want to use this as a thought piece for you folks today, because it's not I'm not trying to constitutionalize your collection development, but there's legitimate reasons to bring a book into the library. And in a school setting, there's 3: relevance to the state standards for education, relevance to the curriculum that's being taught in that particular class, or relevance to the unique role of a school library. And that covers a wide range of reasons to bring a book into a school setting. It's relevant to a health or sex ed class. It might be a difficult book. It might even be a book that has pictures in it that some people might find offensive or troubling, but it might describe human beings in a way that some people don't actually like. But it's relevant to that state standard and the curriculum for that class. Same thing with AP classes, International Baccalaureate. That's a hard book. It is a difficult book. but I think our kids can read it because it's relevant to the class where there's a teacher in there. History and social studies for our history of, I mean, the way that we talk about race in this country, the relevance of a title across the curriculum and standards and the unique role of the school library is a universal. The idea that I think we have a lot to learn from that here in public libraries, because we have seen the weaponization of the term inappropriate. That book is inappropriate for kids. That book is inappropriate for our community. That book is inappropriate for my particular religious or moral perspective. And yet there are books that are relevant to families, to individuals, not just for the majority population. Is there, in Vermont and in other states, a model for these collection development policies that look at a more affirmative rights framework than simply whether it's illegal or not according to the Miller test? And I would suggest there is. The relevance of a book to a minority population or a majority population, there's a universality to it. Is it appropriate for any particular individual or family? That's up to them. But we live in a world right now that has a set of civil rights frameworks that are expanding, I think, to a good end. 1964 Civil Rights Act requires libraries, and I'm saying this really plainly, it requires libraries and places of public accommodation to not discriminate. 1964 Civil Rights Act. 1964 Civil Rights Act, Title II says you cannot discriminate based on race, color, religion, and national origin in places of public accommodation. Folks, what does that look like for a library collection development policy if we were trying to accommodate the public? What does it look like for a display policy, a meeting room policy? If we, in Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, prohibit discrimination based on race, color, and national origin by programs that receive federal financial assistance, thank you, IMLS. Right now, your county highway department has a policy for non-discrimination in how they do contracting and hiring and firing based on Title VI, because they take federal highway dollars. We certainly have a way to root non-discrimination in our conversations as well. And Title VII of the Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination based on race, color, national origin, sex. And I do want to emphasize it's a Title VII conversation rather than Title II and Title VI on sex, which is also gender identity, and religion by state and government employers. Folks, the 14th Amendment about equal protection is used in both administrative and legal settings to distribute these rights in more places than one. And if we are interested in having a DEI policy that drives our collection development priorities, and if we're looking at diversity, equity, and inclusion without a reference point to civil rights law and equal protection, I think that we're falling short on the reason that we're bringing the book into the library in the first place. And if our only defense is a deeply conflicted First Amendment, we need to figure out the right way to resolve it. Vermont has a robust set of laws about civil rights and anti-discrimination that might be a new basis, again, not to constitutionalize it any more than we're already constitutionalizing everything with the First Amendment, but how do we, as a place that is public accommodation, and how do we, as folks who are required by law to hire people, regardless of their characteristics and demographics, how do we apply that to serving? Well, why do we have that book about a family that has two same-sex parents? It's because it's legal in this country to have gay marriage and same-sex parents. It's relevant to that family. Why do we have a book about a memoir about the transgender experience? Because those humans are protected by law. It's relevant to those humans. Minority, whether it's religious, political, social, minority around religion and creed, minority around sex and gender. These are all areas where we are required by law not to discriminate. All right, my last slide here, and I'd like to open up the conversation to folks and invite you to talk to each other as well as to ask questions or tell me I'm crazy here. That's perfectly acceptable. It's very nice to be visiting with a working group. There's another pathway besides civil rights that you might want to start as an initial step as well. So in Rhode Island, I mentioned earlier how I think that structure where they're looking to protect within the structure of the criminal code, which is being weaponized on those charges of obscenity against libraries and library collections. Rhode Island, in addition to that component about bringing it in more substantial compliance to the Miller test, is also considering a legislative finding. The legislative finding, and I'm suggesting that you would take a look at Vermont statute at 13.2.2802, a finding that says public libraries and educational institutions are essential. A legislative finding that says that we intend to make available to all citizens a current balanced collection that reference materials, periodicals, sound recordings, etc., reflect the cultural diversity and pluralistic nature of American society. Because right now, there's nothing in your state or my state that does this explicitly. We have a body of law that talks about how we run boards, how we run libraries, how we contract, how we hire, but we don't necessarily have something that the legislature has affirmed before. It's in the interest of the state to protect the financial resources of libraries and educational institutions from being expended in litigation, which I think can also be applied to really problematic situations that are intended to grind government to a halt. Folks, this is a thought piece for you, and I appreciate the charge that the working group has in order to consider a wide range of these conversations. I'm very happy to tell you everything I know. Thank you for letting me take a few minutes with you today, and I do appreciate the little extra elbow room here, Catherine, to talk. So,
Thank you so much, John. I really appreciate the time and effort that you put into pulling this presentation together, and I know that you are uniquely positioned, I'd say, you've got quite an expertise in the laws in different states, but I really appreciate that you've taken such a deep dive into Vermont statutes and our framework here in Vermont. This is just really informative for us. And I want to open it up to the working group members. Please come back on camera if you feel comfortable doing that. And if you can either physically raise your hand so I can see it, or raise your hand with the feature within Teams to begin asking questions. Jeanette.
Okay,
Jeanette
well, I'll
Fair.
break the ice here. I don't have a question because I think you covered things wonderfully, but thank you for your presentation. It's probably been one of the best that we have heard throughout the working group, and very relevant.
Did you have any questions or specific things to follow up on or anything? What, I guess, if I could ask you a question, Jeanette, after hearing from John and seeing his presentation, which aspects do you find, and I don't want to put you on the spot, it's early, but just thinking, what aspects do you find particularly salient to our work?
I think just increasing the protections for Vermont libraries and librarians from the current political nature around the country, from creep into our state. We like to think that we're protected here, but you never know which back door is going to open. So a preemptive strike towards that chilling effect that we're seeing around the country.
I think that it's important to, and yes, there is a need to protect the institution and the workforce. But by doing it in a way that is more affirmative about your policies rather than prescriptive, I think is a more robust pathway, particularly given the structure of Vermont state laws. And the nature of your constitutional protections within state statutes as well.
Wendy?
Yeah, I mean, obviously you can tell from my accent that I don't hail from these shores, but the thing that struck me, the one little bit that struck me most of all was when you were talking about the heckler's veto.
Yes.
And that was, I thought, well, that's because from what I've seen, there's a lot of people coming from outside a community to complain about books, to try and get books banned. And I thought, well, that sounds like a way of protecting the library from getting so many actual challenges.
Yes. So the heckler's veto is it's one of those common law principles around the freedom of speech. The idea that we in order to preserve, protect, and defend the commons, we have to guard against the heckler, because the heckler does have the ability to silence debate and discussion by simply heckling and heckling and heckling and heckling. A policy framework for libraries around book bans and challenges that passes a constitutional test, both the federal as well as state constitutional requirements around due process, is not a casual toss-off here. I take that very seriously. But there are conditions under which government needs to be protective of itself in order to continue the work of government. There's a difference also between what is done by state fiat or legislation and what is done at the local level in terms of direct democracy. And what we're seeing around the country is something, when it comes to some of the problems about funding. I did not have a slide about attacks on library funding by censorship groups who have been frustrated with their attempts to censor and have switched over to doing a plebiscite against the library. You know, direct voter elections, direct democracy. In Patmos, the Patmos Library in Michigan, at the Jonesboro-Craighead County Library in Arkansas, the Ketchikan, I believe, in Alaska, though that one did not succeed. The first two succeeded. You know, the voters were asked, do we want to tax ourselves? And if we don't, you know, then the institution shuts down. That component of this is not anything that I'm discussing. You know, the direct democracy issues, it's the state framework and the administrative framework of libraries.
I just have a comment and then a question. It's interesting, Wendy, maybe it's your accent and recognizing where you're from and the hecklers. I'm just reminded of going to punk shows in England, and the heckling from the audience is phenomenal in Great Britain. And it's interesting that that heckler's veto comes to us from common law. So this is just kind of a note. Your people are excellent hecklers.
Yeah, but I can listen to Prime Minister's question time.
Yeah, the Prime Minister's question time. I would never want to be Prime Minister. It is crazy. So a question for John. Something I've heard of folks doing here in Vermont is amending their challenge policies to try to kind of get around that. They'll take challenge. They'll take challenge materials, or they revise their challenge policy to require somebody to be in person in the library handing in a form, for example. So they're trying to get some locality to the challenge, that you have to be in the service population and you demonstrate that by physically coming to the library. Now, if we kept ADA issues aside, because I would imagine that they would do an accommodation if there was a person who said, I live down the block, but I'm in a wheelchair and I can't get there to submit the form. So take that to the side. Is that type of an approach to say the challenge is for local people and local people only? Is that, I know that you can't give us specific legal advice, but your sense on it,
right?
Do you think that is
the intent around preserving the rights framework, both under the First Amendment as well as due process issues? It should be something that we look at either, you know, multiple libraries are looking at it simultaneously with their legal counsel, or we have a conversation perhaps with the Attorney General's office.
Thank you. We're going to hear from Kelly McCagg and then from Christopher.
Hi, Kelly.
Hey, John, how are you doing? I'm still processing everything that you have said. It was very dense and information full. But I just wanted to thank you for mentioning that it's important that we respect the challenge and people's First Amendment right to actually bring that. I think a lot of us have gotten into the headspace where we automatically dismiss them and think of them as trite. Or as challenging our abilities as librarians and as being able to do proper collection development. So I think it's important that we just kind of keep that in the front of our brains when we are managing a challenge. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you for that observation. I think about the term sincerely held belief. It's not directly applicable to the freedom of speech side of things, but it certainly is for freedom of religion. And this country is having a big discussion parallel to freedom of speech around freedom of religion, but deeply held belief, sincerely held belief. And I have to suggest that the ground state, our neutral state here, is to assume that it is deeply held belief that's driving these conversations. However, there is evidence in many places, as I said before, where that deeply held belief might be a mask or a guise, and that is part of the discernment that I think any administrative board or finder of fact, like a jury or a judge, would have to take into account.
Thank you, John. Christopher?
Hi, John. Thank you so much for being here. I really, really appreciate it. I'm Christopher. I'm the executive director of the Vermont Humanities Council and a member of the working group. And also a queer identified person. So it feels very personal to me, this topic, and to my family. I am very grateful for the reframing that several folks have done for me and are doing for me around this. I'm also pretty aware of how focused we can get on good democratic process and making sure that we are constitutionally sound in our arguments. And I think that's very important. I'm not sure that people on the other side, speaking about deeply held, sincerely held beliefs, are actually taking that into account so much. And I sometimes wonder if that puts us at a disadvantage because we are so deeply committed to our democratic and our constitutional processes. That aside, I guess the question that I have is about this effort to limit who can make a challenge. And maybe it's not an aside, actually. It occurs to me that in our ongoing talk about, let's say, funding public schools, there are often arguments made that, well, if you're not a taxpayer, you shouldn't have a say. And I worry that we might end up going down that road here. And I wonder if you can just speak to that.
I am concerned. Yeah, I am concerned about any attempts to limit. And as I mentioned about the Illinois proposed legislation and the Connecticut proposed legislation, I mean, the goals of it in terms of, right to read and protections around the right to access, adding additional restrictions, aside from legitimately available due process focused conditions that are available, I would like to suggest that you folks need to be spending more time on your collection development rubrics rather than your collection retention rubrics, which is why I bring up the human rights, civil rights issues, and the equal protection issues, the anti-discrimination framework, because if you have a basis in law that is simply in reference to a state statute about obscenity, rather than a basis in law under the Miller test that's referencing state statutes about human rights and civil rights, I think it strengthens the reason to bring titles, materials, programs, displays into the library that does not impinge those due process rights. It is instead about the anti-discrimination framework of public accommodation. So moving it from the end of the challenge to the beginning of why we bring the material into the library in the first place, the Miller test, the Constitution requires us to look at what relevant state statutes are. You have relevant state statutes. I mean, I want to say this as gently as I can. A lot of DEI initiatives in libraries have only been done because we are virtuous, nice people who care about other humans, we have not been referencing the body of civil rights laws deeply in our conversations.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I think that, I know, John, in talking with you briefly in preparation for your presentation today, that was something that really struck me about the framework that you're recommending. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about, I know that it's hard to hear sometimes, but it's sort of, we're collecting because one ought to collect it, rather than what is the real basis, and how should we be framing that, as far as, we use sort of vague language, that the collections will reflect the diversity of the community. And if the community isn't diverse, then it's just a collection of like books about white people. But perhaps, especially in a state that's so lacking in ethnic diversity as Vermont, perhaps there's another approach we should be taking to prepare us as a bunch of, I don't know a good way to put this, but to prepare lots of white people for going out into the world.
Certainly.
Perhaps.
And speaking from where I'm sitting here as a white cisgendered male in his early 50s, I have nothing to say other than let's look at the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Let's look at Title IX in the Education Amendments of 1972, which Title IX, those of you who follow education policy, is the reason that girls' sports and boys' sports can be funded in somewhat of an equal measure, but it's also protection for students to access the curriculum, gender minorities, sexual minorities to access the curriculum. Those kinds of civil rights guarantees here are not to suggest for a moment that a DEI initiative has been a waste of time. It's to root it in a statutory framework that requires anti-discrimination practices by government and places of public accommodation. Fundamentally, whether you are actively engaged in collecting for minority populations. And remember, the Civil Rights Act has race, creed, color, gender. Forgive me, I have to go back to my slides and hit all of the key points. But the reason that we're collecting is to protect the majority and the minority in an anti-discrimination framework.
It's really helpful. Thank you so much. Are there any other quick questions from the working group? I think we have about 2 minutes before we need to move to our next presenter. Andy.
Hi, Andy.
Hello, just a statement more than anything else, which is this has been really fascinating. So thank you so much for this. And, the perspective you're taking is intriguing to me. So thanks.
Thank you. You're very kind for saying that. I do think that there's a few states out there, and Vermont's one of them, that has an opportunity to have this dialogue happen without duress. And the rearguard action that we would be trying to run in Arkansas, where they've just passed SB 81, which criminalizes librarianship in education. SB 81 in Arkansas amends the criminal code to remove the defense from prosecution. And now you got county prosecutors in Arkansas on July 1st who can start going after them, librarians, with criminal charges. I mean, we cannot have this kind of a dialogue in Arkansas, and we need to nationally. This is not a federal framework. The federal framework's already there. I mean, you're not going to get Congress to pass a new Civil Rights Act just for libraries. It's already there. So how do we, as a multi-state conversation, move this forward? I mean, that's one of the reasons I'm so excited to talk to the working group today, because I think Vermont has an opportunity to do a very deliberative dialogue to preserve those due process rights while affirming the reasons we do our collections in the first place.
Thank you so much, John. And I do appreciate your being here today and taking the time to speak with us, and the great thought and preparation you put into your presentation, and that shared your expertise with us. So thank you.
Thank you. Be well, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day. Cheers.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, we've started off with a bang. So I'm really glad that we are all here today, and we have more folks who are expert in the topics of intellectual freedom who are scheduled a little bit later this morning. But first, we will hear from Lauren Kelly from the Department of Libraries. Lauren is our cataloging consultant, and Lauren has worked with Josh Muse and April Shaw and Tom McMurdo, all of whom are here to field questions. Lauren's going to take us through a very dense PowerPoint. I think it took all the green out of my coffee machine. So I hope that folks will take the opportunity to hear what Lauren has to share about Vermont collections and collection trends. This is a presentation that is really framing our physical and online collections, what we know about it, sharing the data and the perspective that the state library has on those. It's not going to drill down into the specific holdings of specific libraries, but it is going to give you an overview of the department's collections and also the shared resources that we have in our state, and the usage over time of materials and types of materials, which I think is germane to this topic of intellectual freedom when we think about the maintenance of collections. And I hope it's okay if I just say something really quickly before you jump in. Something I sometimes lose sight of, and maybe this is an embarrassing thing to admit. I sometimes lose sight of why we do what we do. I sometimes start thinking too much about moving the books around, doing direct reader's advisory, answering a reference question. And I sometimes lose sight of the fact that we are, at our heart, the library, the importance of it is to keep ideas circulating in our communities, to keep that access to the thoughts of others and the exchange of ideas. And maybe thinking about this, looking at Lauren as Lauren's about to present, helps me a little bit to keep that in mind. Lauren and I sometimes have little conversations here and there about the fact that we're both philosophy majors. And I've been thinking about that a lot lately. Like, how do I use my philosophy degree? And really, like, what we're doing when we're having a library program, or what we're doing when we're selecting books, is we're helping to cultivate that exchange of ideas that supports our humanity, supports the thinking that we are learning to do and continuing to do every day. So just for us to bear in mind, when we narrow the number of materials available, we're tightening down what people are able to learn about and think about and exchange ideas about in the community. So for that reason, I do feel that this topic of collections is really relevant to the topic of intellectual freedom, and us maintaining robust collections is relevant to the topic of intellectual freedom. And now I'm going to stop talking and turn off my camera and turn it over to my colleague, Lauren.
Thank you. And thank you for sharing all of that. Coming on the heels of what we just listened to is very interesting. And we care a lot about what we do. But that is reflected in the collections and the trends that we're seeing. And so I'm Lauren Kelly, the Technical Services Consultant here at the department. Today, we're going to be going into the collections and resources that the State Library offers, as well as those shared resources, as Kathy pointed out, interlibrary loan, the courier system. And then we'll go into the public library collection data and trends. There will be a lot of data. There will be a lot of tables. Our time is a little bit limited today. We do want to save enough time for questions at the end. So I do invite you, when the website is back up, to go into this presentation, use the data, look at things more deeply if we don't have time to really get into the nitty-gritty today. We will talk about the impact of COVID, of course, on collection data and trends that we've seen. And then we'll zoom out a little bit into a national collection trends, and then come back with a comparison of how Vermont ranks in those different trends. So starting off with the state library, we do have to follow the state statutes that relate to our operations. These are listed out here, as well as the website, which I won't get into today, but just a general sense of we are guided by very specific directives and that's kind of what we base our collections on. So currently, approximations, there are 18,000 physical books, and we do cater to a library science section for Vermont librarians, as well as our audience of state employees. We have about 60 professional development physical materials for them, and there are 5,000 government documents, 85 serial subscriptions. Of course, we focus on Vermont material, Vermont law, Vermont authors, Native Americans, and then, as I said, library science and state employee professional development. There's also a youth collection, and those are the majority. They do circulate, and we have seen kind of, once again, the pandemic. We see in fiscal year 20, fiscal year 21, and 22 a little bit of a dip. So far, the collection is hopefully on an upwards trajectory. Primarily, book discussions are what gets circulated the most from the state library. There is a smaller amount of youth items, Vermont related materials, and the library science collections in circulation as well. The ABLE Library also operates out of the Department of Libraries. Audio, Braille, Large Print, Electronic is the acronym. They have 12,000 large print books, and of those books, deposit collections get sent out to public libraries to supplement their own local collections of large print materials. Especially as those large print versions can be much more expensive than the standard print edition. They also have 280 Braille books, 350 accessible youth items, which fall into different types of talking books, books that are audio enabled, as well as high contrast and larger print, but not quite large print. There's also a program for talking books on cartridges that get sent out, and 111,000 books on demand through the BARD program from the National Institute. Their circulation is quite large, 9,367 large print books. And as you can see, there are different ways that those get circulated to the public, whether that be directly to ABLE patrons or through those deposit collections at libraries around the state. And then there's also participation in interlibrary loan, which we will talk about in a moment. Lots of digital talking books, as well as through the BARD program, ebooks and e-Braille. So lots of different formats and lots of circulation, which we love to see. Worth mentioning, a resource that is set up through the department is that the Massachusetts Higher Education Consortium has discounts available for collection development book jobbers like Baker and Taylor, Ingram, Midwest Tapes, Blackstone, Brodart, and that's not just physical books, that's also audiobooks, DVDs, anything that you could want. There also is like shelving and other physical things for libraries that you do get a discounted rate, and that is set up through the department. There are also legal resources. Vermont Department of Libraries holds a contract with Westlaw, which allows state departments to sign up for access to a database that has legal resources for their employees. And then we also partner with CLIC, the Community Legal Information Center, which gives access to the law library collection in Randolph, as well as legal reference services and self-help books available for interlibrary loan. So that's a really good resource for, a very tricky subject that requires expertise. When it comes to interlibrary loan usage, Clover is our web-based program, and every library in the state has an account and can access the system to send requests to borrow the items. Libraries are able to set their lending policies for item formats, locations, and statuses. Currently active on Clover, we have 149 public libraries, 64 school libraries, 6 academic libraries, and 1 special library. And over here in the tables, you can see that these numbers are, a bit of a dip during 2020. We will talk about that in a second. But for the most part, we are projected to keep these books flowing around the state and from out of state as well. The courier system is an important facet to interlibrary loan. This is how, through Priority Express, these items get couriered to different libraries. There are 124 public libraries on the courier system, 7 school libraries, 3 academic libraries, and 1 special library. And as you can see in these tables, these are the amount of items that are sent through the courier for the different fiscal years. Once again, that dip in 2020, but as you can see in 2022, really the highest number out of the last 4 years. So moving a lot of items. And as I've mentioned, the COVID-19 impact, it did shut the courier down for 6 weeks. And then most libraries restarted courier services by October 2020, except for, of course, our Haskell Library up on the border, but they came back on in 2021. Some of the IMLS ARPA funds were used to increase the amount of courier grants during this period when things were kind of getting back into the swing of things. Libraries were offered grants that covered half the cost of 1 stop per week if they had 1 stop per week. So that was very helpful. In total, the grants for this period cost $74,074.26. When it comes to databases, the Vermont Department of Libraries offers a plethora of different online resources, and there are 50 databases from Gale alone in the Vermont Online Library, various age ranges from elementary to college to adult professionals. There are accessibility features built in for these things, which is always a great aspect to online resources. For Learning Express, these are career, job hunting, resume, cover letter, all of those resources to support that kind of work, citizenship test as well in that database. And then Udemy is a new project which hasn't quite, I think it has been launched at this point. It's a collection of over 14,000 video tutorials and courses available to Vermonters. And it has a large range of, computer skills, tech skills, professional skills, as well as hobby and recreational tutorials and courses. Talking a little bit about use, there is a lot of data that I won't get into at the moment, but as you can see, we have many sessions, many searches, many full text retrievals. Universal class will end in 2023, and Udemy is really the replacement for that, offering video tutorials and courses online. And then Learning Express has decreased a bit. This is just a table showing usage as well. Of course, we see, a dip once again, 2020, hopefully further trajectory usage increases. So the cost for these items, or rather these databases, we do see that there is quite a jump for the next fiscal year, but then there's a smaller jump after that, and then an even smaller increase. So this is built into the budget for the state department. Something new that has launched last summer is the Palace Project. Here we have some stats on the offerings. English ebooks, 3,162 of them, 3,305 English audiobooks, 1,156 non-English materials, the majority of them being ebooks, 187 professional library resources, and 92 professional development resources. So reflecting the physical collection and the audience that the state library serves. It is, I'm sure people have heard about it, but it serves as a core collection for libraries in the state, and then patrons can access those resources through their libraries. And we did put an importance of non-English titles going to support serving migrant worker communities, existing refugees, and new Americans in the state. Can be a little bit difficult collection development wise when we have librarians that may not speak the language. So there are some high quality texts that we got through working with our vendor Baker and Taylor, quality control, and making sure that those items would be sought after. And a special thing about the Palace Project app is that it aggregates different publishers and vendors, their materials into one app to use. And then libraries also have the option to purchase their own materials that show up in there specifically for their patrons. So far, we have seen the usage increase, of course, as we've added libraries. There are currently 70+ libraries on the platform and an additional 59 slated for this ongoing onboarding phase. We should mention that the Green Mountain Library Consortium has been working to provide a downloadable ebook and e-audiobook solution for Vermont libraries for the past 15 years. Their collection stands around 13,757 ebooks, plus 20,000 Project Gutenberg public domain titles that are high quality, 12,351 ebooks or audiobooks, excuse me, 240,909 ebooks circulated within the last 12 months. So you see circulation and usage of this product is quite high, as well as 388,732 ebooks circulated in the last year. There are currently 156 participating libraries in this consortium, and the subscription costs are really based on the number of registered patrons and circulation. So when it comes to what we're seeing, collection data and trends and public libraries, and kind of coming off the previous presentation that we just heard, here's just an example of the Middlebury Ilsley Public Library policy draft. Library boards work with library staff to develop collection development policies. Something, I think considerably unique about Vermont is that the majority of our libraries are standalone. We don't really have many branch libraries if we do. So each public library locally controls its collection development policy and which titles are available to their community at the library level, at the board level. So when it comes to the Vermont public libraries, for the majority of the statistics that you'll be presented with, they do come in the form of a median number. And we see here that the median number of non-traditional items is 29 at Vermont Public Library. So starting to see that as a trend in collections. But the largest slice of the pie is, of course, adult print, and then coming right behind that is print for children and youth collection. The electronic holdings, they are mostly consortial, what we see in the state, slightly more ebooks, and then audiobooks as well. And there are more subscription services offering magazines, video streaming. We don't have the data on those things, but those are also out there. So it's worth noting that a significant number of users may have shifted from physical library usage to private downloadable services because the aggressive consumer pricing, which we'll talk about in a minute as well, and the limitations that publishers put on library e-lending. So we have our e-circulation all the way on the right here. That pertains to that. And once again, these are the from the public library survey. And so these are the report years. In 2021, libraries, the median number figure that they spent on collections was over $8,000 with 3.62 per capita. 14,480 physical items in the collection, and then 6,121 was the circulation for that year, the median circulation. And this is a table representing the same information. We've also broken it down by the library size. And we will say that currently the Public Library Survey does not collect statistics around the age of collections, nor does it talk about the percentage of collection in use, which would be interesting figures to see when we're talking about collections. So once again, we see median by library size. So all of the data that we're seeing today needs to be thought about in the way of the impact of COVID-19 on the circulation of materials, on our collections. Digital resource circulation increased, especially because people were not able to go into physical spaces. The physical resource circulation decreased because of that. Kind of no-brainer. Libraries were closed or reduced hours or no in-person browsing. Curbside did alleviate some of that, total breakdown of the process, or front door service. A lot of libraries adopted an appointment only or limited hours to get some circulation. But there was also a lot of quarantining materials, which took materials out of circulation and out of the collection for up to a week in some libraries. We also saw a lot of shipping delays from book jobbers, as well as the courier system shutting down for 6 weeks, impacting interlibrary loan. When it comes to maybe a bright side of the impact of COVID, through the IMLS ARPA grants, there was some increased funding for collections. In total, overall, over the 2 different grant periods, the Department of Library sent out over $1,500,000 to public libraries. 166 public libraries received funds for purchases, and grant round 2 public libraries were encouraged to expand their EDI collections and spending those funds on books. There also was a large chunk, 200,000, that went to the Green Mountain Library Consortium to kind of help with the logjam of digital and e-content. And then for the state library collections, ARPA funds allowed really the majority of the Palace Project e-content to be purchased. With that being said, because it was this IMLS ARPA funding, we had to opt for a perpetual licensing model, which actually helped for the sustainability of the project. $252 to $39 were spent on that content. 10,720 went to physical items for the state collection. And then also back to our statutes, to support the state institution collections, there was $84,000 that went to those collections. When we're talking about national trends and format preference, there has been a large increase in digital in general. Ebooks usage increased from 25% to 30% of these people surveyed in this Pew Research Center survey, which is linked in the resources at the end of the presentation. This format is most popular among the 18 to 29 age range. And for audiobook usage, for adults with an annual income of less than $30,000, there has been a large increase from 14% to 22%. And 33% of those surveys have read both print and digital books in the past year. So we're not seeing a full trend to solely digital. Print, in fact, still remains the most popular format. 33% of US adults report reading print and ebooks in the last 12 months, and 9% report reading digital books only. So once again, 9%. When we talk about and digital content, it's really important to recognize kind of the economic landscape that is present with especially the big 5 publishers. They have a lot of control over what the market looks like. The School Library Journal published this wonderful graphic here on the left, kind of breaking down the different prices that libraries pay for these materials. Physical items are talked about in the graph. And then, as I was mentioning, when it comes to the licensing from these publishers for digital content, as you can see, it's $50 to $60 for a 2-year library license. That means that it will go away after 2 years. You will have to repurchase it. Whereas if you're a consumer, a single individual, you can usually buy an audiobook for $12 or $15 and have it in perpetuity. So that creates a large problem when it comes to collection development of those materials. When it comes to the national rankings for collection expenditures and holdings, we have noticed kind of anecdotally that Vermont seems to be on a bit of a trend of downsizing physical DVDs and audiobooks in some collections. That is not everywhere, and that's more anecdotal. But despite the decrease in physical collection use, total library collections, physical and digital use, reached a record high of $2.98 billion in 2019, which has been a lot of growth since 2013. So the first column that we have on the left, collection expenditures, Vermont ranks 31st in the nation. For the amount of print materials, Vermont ranks 4th. For audio materials, talking about physical audio materials, Vermont ranks 10th. And for video materials, once again, physical, Vermont ranks 5th in the country. For our national rankings for circulation, Vermont is 29th for total circulation. For electronic circulation, Vermont ranks 40th. And then for children's circulation in general, Vermont ranks 25th. There are some resources. Like I said, I've kind of blown through a lot of data today. So please dive in to the presentation. It will be up on the website, which I believe our website has been restored at the moment. I think I saw a note of that. But yeah, we have time for questions. So
that was really a great presentation. Thank you, Lauren, for pulling that together. There is so much data that the Info and Access Services team kind of poured over here, and there's so much work being done in this realm. Somehow, despite all of the data, I still enjoyed listening to you. So great presentation. You really tied it together in a way that was helpful. I want to call on Assistant State Librarian Tom McMurdo for just a second.
Oh, there I am. Hi, folks. I just wanted to add a little context to the rising cost of databases. So to give you some perspective on this, our annual increase over the next 3 years is 4.25% for next year, and then 1.8%, and then 1.47%. Then that's over each previous year. But the total amount that we're looking at is 4.25% for next year. But in 2 years, it'll be 7.68%, which is about $60,000 that we have to come up with for databases between today and 3 years from today. So if you think about that amount, that is the better part of a full-time position. So and we're not adding any databases. This is the market costs as they rise over each year. So I know all of you know this, that we see a rising cost for everything in libraries, but this is just a constant in our work here. So thank you.
Thanks, Tom, for sharing that. And I want to share a little context with the working group too. Speaking of the rising cost of databases, there are a lot of states that are trimming their databases, just in recognition that they cannot afford to continue to offer them. And particularly since our databases sometimes can be aspirational. Sometimes we're seeing a really high cost per use. And so that is something that we have to look at carefully. And on this particular slide, we'll put in I think we're going to put in a revised version of this slide because we have had to make a couple of adjustments to the offerings that we're going to have at the Department of Libraries, because our universal class database, while it's really, it is pretty well used, it's quite expensive per use. And the platform has not been really consistent over the years. That database was, I'm going to get this wrong and I might need Tom to come back on and save me, but I think it was hosted by a different vendor before Overdrive, and the future of it is a little bit iffy with Overdrive. And our team evaluated the Udemy platform and found it's really a great platform. And so we're going to be shifting over to Udemy, just in recognition of the fact that we didn't receive a huge budget increase, and we do have to stay within our established budget. So we'll come back with a slightly different, we'll post a slightly revised slide 16, I think. And Josh had made a comment in the chat that I want to just call out. There is a factor of, I don't even know, 10 or 20. There's the slide, one of the slides that talks about the total collection size should be 2.73 million, not billion items. And something that had come up for the department when we've spoken with the consultants who supported us in our LSTA 5-year plan is that sometimes it will look like having a big collection is a good thing. And sometimes it can be a reflection of delayed collection maintenance or lacking collection maintenance. And one thing that we don't have data on here at the state's Department of Libraries is that we don't really know the age of the collections. So you'll often see that we're doing really well in the size of our collection, but we suspect that there may be that the collections may be kind of packed onto the shelves, and there may be some old materials that may not have the most current and relevant information, especially in the nonfiction areas. So that's not data that we have. We don't have the average age of collections in the state, I don't believe. So I want to open it up now to the working group to ask questions of Lauren and Tom, and we also have April and Josh here who can help to answer questions, as well as Karen with questions about the ABLE library or the corrections. Sorry, Karen, to put you on the spot, but I know you can handle it. Tom?
Yeah, just very briefly, a lot of data, short period of time. I want to note that the numbers I quoted are not just for the databases, but for all of our software purchases. So the numbers on that slide are closer to what we're actually paying. So just wanted to make sure for the record that that was correct. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, working group, you have about 10 minutes to ask questions, and Jeanette, your hand is up. Go.
So you've referred to the cost per use a couple times, but that wasn't on a slide. Is that information available on For instance, universal class, what we are paying on average per use?
I'm gonna check with Tom's team if they happen to know that specific information, but I think we could probably provide that in the written report from the department if we don't have it today.
I don't think I have it at hand, but we could put it together.
Yeah, we would basically look at the data that we report in our I think for universal class and some of the other databases, we have a breakout of how many uses we have, and then we would look at it as compared with the contract cost.
Yeah, simple math.
Yeah, simple math. Just didn't think to put that one in, but my sense is that there are a small number of dedicated learners in that platform currently. And so we'll need to be transitioning them over to a different platform of very similar content and a more affordable price point. We really have to try to get something that works with the budget that we have. And the team was really, the Info and Access Services team selected a different vendor and a different product to meet the needs of folks. Some of the databases, they start you out with a kind of a sweetheart deal and then they hike the prices. And so then if you're in a situation where you don't have a similarly increasing budget, like our department budget, we stayed within the 3% cap that the Agency of Administration and the governor wanted us to. So we weren't able to grow the databases. So then we have to either cut something else or cut the collections. So that can be a challenge, especially if folks are relying on that, on a particular resource with particular content for curricular needs. So let's see, are there other comments and questions from the working group?
Well, if not, I'll just
Keep
toss out a
going.
comment.
Yeah.
In regard to the size of the collections, taking nonfiction off the table, because that is very relevant, the age of the collections. But looking at fiction, that because of the size of the average Vermont library, those do get weeded. The older books do usually get weeded out, and that's not necessarily a good thing. There's still readership for those older fiction. It used to be held at Vermont State Regional Libraries, which has been eliminated. And so access to either older authors or older books within currently writing authors are hard to come by. So that's just throwing that out there, that the age of the collection isn't necessarily a bad thing, particularly in fiction.
Yeah, and I do think that next month we will see a slide about the collection size of the state library. Next month we'll be meeting on the topic of organizations and structures, and we have a report from the department planned on the history, and I think that the collection size will be included in that, but it's a good point that you make. Something I noticed in this report was that our physical collections in Vermont continue to be utilized well. They continue to be circulating, and the physical movement of interlibrary loan is rebounding, has rebounded. The projections are that we would have, I think I just put this in the chat before, but the projection is that we will be back up where we were previously from the data that the team has shared with us. So pre-pandemic, we were at 51,485 interlibrary loans. And if the projection for Q4 is accurate, then we would be exceeding that now. So we would have completely rebounded and started to grow. And remember, interlibrary loan is, of course, the physical movement of those materials. And the courier system would be growing now at this point after having taken a significant dip. So for people who think that Vermonters might not be reading print materials, I would share these statistics with them. Wendy, did you have something? You came on screen. I was excited.
You want me
one
to
area.
say something? I'll say that we use many of the services that the state provides at our library and enjoy them. I don't know what else to say.
I mean, something that's noticeable to me when we look at this is it's in terms of the physical collections, the department's positioned primarily to report out about public libraries. And I don't need the rest of my fingers. We're really positioned just to talk about public libraries. We don't have any statistics or data that we gather from academic libraries or from school libraries in the state, either public or private. And that is an information gap. We don't historically have that information. And we, with our limited staffing, don't really have tons of capacity to try to gather that information. And we did reach out to AOE about what information they have, and they don't really capture that at the school level from what I understand either. The high cost of digital resources are something we might want to talk about. The working group might want to make recommendations about, if there's anything we think we could do about that. Just thinking through some of the things. And I do also want to share about the Palace app. That is something that we're really growing. And in addition to the more than 3,000 ebooks and more than 3,000 e-audiobooks that the department has built for that kind of evergreen perpetual license collection, that may sound small to you at first. You'll think, oh, it's just, 6,400 books that we can access. But the Palace app also provides a platform that includes 15,000 open source materials. So the Palace app, which many state libraries are utilizing so that we have this more affordable and more content neutral app. That's really the point of it. It has a core collection of 15,000 items. And then we at the state library leveraged our ARPA funds to get more than 6,000 more items. And those are the base. And then at your public library, as you come on board, your patrons have access to that base of more than 21,000 titles that are all perpetual license. Then you supplement that with your local collection. So I had seen something in Vermont Digger about how there was one of the librarians was saying, oh, we have fewer. Well, I don't think that's possible because you should still have your own. And then you have the base and you have our core collection. So hopefully that would give you more. So we right now don't have at the state library a model where we have funding to provide an ever-growing collection of new titles. So we really are focusing on the perpetual license titles and making sure that everybody has access to those. And the goal is really to have a platform that helps to pull in your content from different areas. And we're building that out for public libraries right now. So we have a lot of folks who have come on board initially, about 60 or so. And I think that we're bringing on another cohort in the coming months. And so the goal is to get all of the libraries in the state participating in that. Are there any other thoughts or questions? I just want to thank Lauren for that presentation. It was so great. And I also want to call attention. You may notice behind Lauren, for a bit of levity, you may notice that behind Lauren, do you want to move your camera up a tiny bit? Behind Lauren is a cutout of, if you're wondering what's behind her, it's a Chester A. Arthur cutout, which has been modified based on Lauren's personal love of the Golden Girls. That is Chester B. Arthur behind Lauren. lest you think everything is just no fun in info and access services. There's quite a lot going on in their unit.
I will say that this idea was not mine. It was present before I even arrived, but thanks for listening to the presentation today, and please check it out, dive into the numbers later on the website.
Thanks, Lauren. And I see Andy's got his hand up quickly.
Yeah, I just want to take the opportunity to do the equivalent of laughing.
I figured in a 6-hour meeting, we needed a moment of levity. And Lauren, I feel for you because, you know, yeah, your coworkers, they have unusual senses of humor. And with that, I understand that Dana Kaplan, the executive director of Outright Vermont, is here. Welcome, Dana. I'm Kathy. I'm the state librarian.
Hi, Kathy. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too. I'm going to turn it over to you for the next, let's see, the next 15 minutes. So we'll hear from you for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have opportunity for questions and answers. So thank you so much for being here today to talk with us about intellectual freedom.
Sure. And I am going to start and just speak specifically about Outright. I don't know how many folks are familiar with Outright Vermont and the work that we do across the state. But if you bear with me, I'll kind of go through and use my 10 minutes to share with you what I have written up here, and I'm happy to answer questions after that. So I want to thank you first and foremost for inviting me to speak with you today. I think Outright has a unique position in terms of understanding the needs of a social identity that oftentimes is targeted and needing levels of support and care, especially from places like libraries that can be a real safe haven. For the record, my name is Dana Kaplan. I use he and him pronouns, and I am the executive director of Outright Vermont. Our organization works statewide to build hope, equity, and power so that youth, their families, and communities can gain skills and find belonging in a world that really was never designed for them to succeed. I really do want to thank you for understanding the importance of making sure that schools are meeting the needs of all Vermonters and communities are meeting the needs of all Vermonters, especially for young folks who, by no fault of their own, face disproportionate risk compared to their peers. I think it's really, really important that we're crystal clear that according to minority stress theory, the increased risk of mental health distress that is faced by LGBTQ folks is due specifically to the increased environmental stress of navigating a world with prejudice towards your very identity. The increased rates of depression, substance use, and suicidal ideation are not inherent or inevitable to LGBTQ identities. Rather, it's the outsized amount of stigma, rejection, and exposure to structural and interpersonal discrimination that have devastating impacts on the overall physical and mental health of marginalized people, including LGBTQ folks. I think it's important that we look at those impacts on Vermont's youth. As many of you likely know, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey data, YRBS, is collected every 2 years for middle and high school students across the state. It estimates that 14% of our state's youth identify as LGBTQ, and that's probably low. And it clearly underscores the risks across the board. According to the 2019 results, 50% of LGBTQ youth, and again, this is here in Vermont, self-harmed, compared with 13% of their cisgender and heterosexual peers. 36% made a suicide plan in the last 12 months, compared to 9% of their peers. And 19% of LGBT youth attempted suicide in the last 12 months, compared to 4% of their peers. So put a different way, LGBTQ youth were 5 times as likely to have attempted suicide in that year than their peers. I think it's really, really important that we keep in mind that this data is from before the pandemic, which only served to amplify the isolation that youth experience daily. So today we find ourselves at this intersection of decades of systemic harm, amplified by a global pandemic and overlaid with an unprecedented level of coordinated transphobic and homophobic efforts across the nation. These are hate campaigns that are targeting trans youth specifically, stripping them of their rights to gender-affirming healthcare, to participating in school sports, to access to school curriculum, facilities, and systems that reflect the truth of their lived experience. The surge of legislative activity reflects an increasingly hostile environment for LGBTQ rights across the country, and it's a phenomenon that we fear will have disastrous consequences for youth and LGBTQ youth and trans youth in particular. And the reason that we know that to be true, there was a poll from the Trevor Project in January. The Trevor Project is an organization that provides crisis support for LGBTQ folks, and found that 85% of trans and non-binary youth said that their mental health was negatively affected by these laws. I think it's really, really important that we connect the dots to the ways that our political climate has real life consequences on youth's daily lives. And one of those connections is to LGBTQ youth and their lack of safety. Now, when it comes to intellectual freedom in the libraries, we know that the efforts are escalating to undermine, and that the American Library Association data in March revealed that 1,269 demands to censor library books and resources in 2022, which is the highest number of attempted book bans that the ALA has recorded in over 20 years, nearly double the 729 challenges that were reported in 2021. And we know that youth and LGBTQ folks and people of color are being targeted directly and bear the brunt of these consequences. Of the challenge titles, the vast majority were written by or about members of the LGBTQ plus community and people of color. The majority of 2022 censorship attempts, 58%, targeted information that's accessible to youth, books and materials in school libraries, classroom libraries, or school curricula. Now, this is not about specific books. This is about freedom of thought and expression. These are attempts to not just censor the content of a single book, but to erase an entire idea from the public sphere. In 2022, 90% of the overall number of books challenged were part of attempts to censor multiple titles, and 40% were in cases involving 100 or more books. Prior to 2021, the vast majority of challenges to library resources only sought to remove or restrict access to a single book. Now, we know that under Vermont law, all youth have the right to learn and to exist free from the threat of harm. But even here in Vermont, there is a continuous barrage of messages that are targeting LGBTQ youth, telling them that they're not valued, cared for, or allowed to exist. The idea that books where their identities are represented are obscene, pornographic, and inappropriate for school contributes to a culture of shame that puts all youth at risk. But we know what helps. Affirming schools where youth feel safe and validated, being open about their identities, where they have at least one supportive adult in their lives, social safe havens like Gender and Sexuality Alliance clubs, and inclusive curriculum and policies. In those instances, positive health outcomes are possible. And in fact, we're talking about a significant protective factor against suicidality. According to the Trevor Project, youth in schools that were not affirming of their identity were nearly twice as likely to have attempted suicide in the past year. But safety isn't guaranteed, and ongoing training and policy guidance is critical. We know that schools need consistent and actionable guidance from agencies like the Department of Education and the Vermont Department of Libraries, so they can be creating cultures and conditions where all youth thrive. They also need continued resources and support to know how to prevent discrimination, harassment, and bullying. Just ask a shy 10 or 12-year-old where they find solace. Libraries are a typical hub for youth who can't otherwise find places of connection and safety, and school libraries can continue to be key partners in these efforts that ensure that level of safety for all. We know, according to the American Association of Libraries, that intellectual freedom is every learner's right. In order to develop essential life skills like empathy and critical thinking, youth need to access a wealth of information and perspectives and the guidance of trusted advisors. It's critical that youth see themselves reflected in the materials that are available to them, but also for youth who are not LGBTQ to engage in perspectives that are different from their own. In a rural state, isolation can run deep, separating youth from each other and making access to information and resources impossible. So inclusive curriculum in the classroom is essential. Libraries should have the resources and supports that they need to meet youth where they are, with robust and challenging collections of materials. Furthermore, as we can all appreciate, psychological safety is a prerequisite for any and all learning, full stop. Materials and programs that reflect a wide variety of identities and experiences, most especially for young people on the margins, BIPOC and LGBTQ youth, are pivotal so that they can see possibilities for themselves into the future. We all need to have places where we belong, and programs like Drag Queen Story Hour ensure that youth come to know that libraries are a safe and creative place where their joy and truth is welcome and celebrated. So in this moment where we find ourselves, if we aren't providing safe schools for LGBTQ youth, we aren't providing safe schools at all. And anything less than coordinated, intentional, and robust efforts to ensure safe and equitable schools just won't do. I implore you all to take every opportunity that you can in some way, large or small, to help rectify the very real lived impact of ignorance, hate, and harassment on policy levels, in trainings, in curriculum. And as it should be, we continue to set precedent for other states on what community care, resilience, and equity looks like. This is the Vermont that we need to keep working towards every day, and you all have a pivotal role to play in it. Thanks.
Thank you, Dana. We have just a few minutes for questions and comments. Working group members, if you are able to come back on and raise your hand if you have questions on what Dana shared with us, this important information and call to support LGBTQI youth particularly. In the chat, Christopher just cheered on Dana and thanked him for all that he does. Questions or comments?
Just a comment, Kathy. I'm a volunteer at Outright, and I'll actually be there tonight, supporting the queer youth group. And I can't emphasize enough the truth of what Dana spoke to for this group, that libraries are sanctuaries and safe havens for queer young people. And I personally believe that that is one of the reasons why they are being targeted in this manner right now, is because for generations, librarians have been supportive people for queer youth.
We run a Gender and Sexuality Alliance network here in Vermont with about 90 middle, elementary, and high schools that have these social and support clubs in them. And there are many, many of those clubs that meet in the school library that have an advisor that is a librarian. Like I haven't actually crunched the numbers and looked at the data there, but there is absolutely truth to the fact that those are pivotal spaces where people find safety.
Dana, you talked a lot about the school library setting, and I'm wondering, do you feel that the ideas that you spoke about are also as relevant in the public library setting and in the academic library settings?
Sure, absolutely. I think that we largely focus on what's happening within school systems, but we know that the importance of third spaces and places like public libraries and other academic libraries, absolutely. I mean, these are threads that continue in all public spheres. So there may be some young people who do not feel like they can access the information that they need in their school environment. And so they might turn to a public library for anonymity, for a lot of folks who might not be out, or for whom they are out and they have been targeted and therefore are not safe. Public libraries become essential.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much for making the time to be with us today and
Sure.
to share your perspective and to represent
Okay, thank you.
many of the folks, youth who are not here with us today as well. So we really appreciate your time, and you're welcome to stay on with us. We're going to move to our next presenter, who's Trina Maggi. I hope I said that correctly, Trina.
Close enough. It's Maggie. Thank you, Kathy.
Trina Maggi, who is, thank you. Trina is here, and Trina's the co-editor of the Intellectual Freedom Manual. And Trina is also a library professor at UVM, and today is presenting Trina's own perspective, not that of her, I didn't check on your pronouns, not UVM's perspective. So I'm going to turn it over to Trina now.
Hi, thank you, Kathy. And hello, everyone. What a great group of people. It's so wonderful to see the group coming together to talk about intellectual freedom. And for me, it's a great honor to have been invited to talk to you this morning a little bit. Yeah, my remarks are my own this morning. I'm not speaking on behalf of the university, but I just want to tell you just a wee bit about my background. I served as treasurer and president of the Vermont Library Association, and also as chair of its Intellectual Freedom Committee. And in that capacity, led an effort to enact the Vermont Statute on Privacy of Library Records. I also worked with Bernie Sanders to try to amend the USA Patriot Act to protect privacy of library records. I would say if my specialty is in anything, it would be in the area of privacy. So here's what I want to talk about with you today: how intellectual freedom can be defined, how it relates to libraries, why it matters, and the source of threats to intellectual freedom. And I will end with some recommendations, humbly offered to the group, for supporting intellectual freedom in Vermont libraries. And I do say humbly because I realize I come to you as an academic librarian, where I believe our lives are much, much easier with regard to intellectual freedom. We rarely get challenges. And so I have great respect and appreciation for my colleagues in the public library environment and the school library. You are on the front lines of some very difficult situations, and I really appreciate your work. So I want to say that I feel not qualified to share data or comment on specific censorship challenges or other attempts to reduce intellectual freedom in recent years. I'm pleased to see that you're hearing from many experts about that today, which will be great. So my view is more of a general bird's eye view. So I'd like to start sharing my screen with you. And I think when I do that, I think I will not be able to see what's going on. So please do interrupt me if something goes amiss, or if there's a question or a reason I need to stop. Don't hesitate to interrupt. So let me see if I can get this going. All right. All right, can you see my screen? It should say how libraries protect intellectual freedom.
We can, yes.
Excellent. Okay, we're off to a good start. All right, so the idea of a library can seem quite simple. We acquire and take care of information resources. We have users who need those information resources. We connect the two, and everybody is happy. But of course, it is not that simple, because questions like this emerge. How do we decide which books to buy? If a user asks us to remove one of them, what should we do? If a faculty member wants to know whether a student used the library, should we tell them? What if it's the police who are asking? Can we deny the requests of certain groups to use the library meeting rooms? Is it a good idea to put warning labels on materials that people might find offensive? And is it okay to restrict students' access to materials based on their grade or reading level? So answering questions like this requires that we think about something called intellectual freedom. And here's one definition of that concept. It's the right of every individual to both seek and receive information from all points of view without restriction. Now, I was reflecting on the fact that libraries have changed so much over the years. But as they've changed, the core principle of intellectual freedom has remained steadfast. It was there in the beginning of libraries, and it's still there like the roots of a mature tree. But it turns out that's not true. Let me explain. The year is 1908. A man named Arthur Bostwick has been elected president of the American Library Association. And in his inaugural address, he says, "Some are born great, some achieve greatness, some have greatness thrust upon them. It is in this way that the librarian has become a censor of literature." What? What did he say? Did he say that we are censors? Let me finish the quote. Books that distinctly commend what is wrong, that teach how to sin and how pleasant sin is, sometimes with and sometimes without the added sauce of impropriety. That is a great phrase, isn't it? Are increasingly popular, tempting the author to imitate them, the publishers to produce, the bookseller to exploit. Thank heaven they do not tempt the librarian. So this quote shows us that the truth is, a long time ago, librarians saw themselves as gatekeepers, controlling the flow of information. They decided what content and literature was good for people, and they prevented people from seeing anything that was, well, a bit too saucy. That was 1908. 30 years later, it is 1939. Hitler has come to power, The Grapes of Wrath and The Wizard of Oz came out that year. Lou Gehrig retired from baseball, and the perspective of librarians had changed dramatically. The American Library Association adopted its first code of ethics, a set of ethical principles to guide people who work in and for libraries. And that original code made reference to intellectual freedom principles, including protection of privacy. A little later in 1939, ALA adopted a second statement called the Library Bill of Rights. And these are basic principles that should govern the service of all libraries. It too contains statements in support of intellectual freedom. You don't have to read these documents word for word right now. Here's a summary of the core principles. And these two bedrock documents have been updated, of course, a few times over the decades, and they continue to serve as the foundation on which library operations are built. And so here are the core principles that are enumerated in these two documents. And when tricky questions, like the ones we looked at earlier, come up, we as library workers can turn to these documents to guide our thinking and decisions. So you see on here lots of information about ensuring the flow of information and ideas, high-level equitable access and service, course-resisting censorship, and note that privacy is on here too. And that's because of our belief that without privacy, people will self-censor. If they have to worry that their name's getting put on a list or someone's looking over their shoulder to find out what they're reading, they might make different decisions and choose not to read certain things. So that's why privacy enters into the picture. We talk about not allowing personal beliefs to interfere with providing access and information, affirming the dignity and rights of every person, access to all points of view, and so on. Now, you may ask, why did librarians decide to issue these statements? Well, it's that libraries came to understand that the freedom to read is essential to democracy, a free society, and a creative culture. Libraries have been called the marketplace of ideas, and it is a raucous marketplace with fresh ideas, ancient ideas, worn out ideas, big ideas and small, clever ideas, well-researched ideas, baseless ideas. Some of those ideas are inspiring, some are thought-provoking, some we might find offensive and shocking. If democracy has any chance at working, people need access to information and the freedom to make their own decisions about what has merit. And this notion is built into our US Constitution, primarily in the First Amendment, which protects the freedom of speech. The First Amendment promises the freedom to speak and write, but of course, much of what goes on in a library is about the other side. It's about hearing, reading, receiving information. Is that covered by the First Amendment? The answer is yes. Courts have determined that this is contained in the First Amendment as well, because they recognize that the right to free speech is useless without the corollary right to receive that speech. In addition, courts have determined that with only a few exceptions, freedom of speech applies to everyone's speech, even speech that some find offensive. Now, this can be difficult for people to accept, so intellectual freedom is often threatened, and these threats come from a variety of sources, including these. First, we think, of course, of library users and other members of the public. And it's important to note this sometimes may mean local people, but it may mean people from far away. And I think you've talked a little bit about that this morning. Very important to note that these threats may come from the political right or the left or anywhere in between. Sometimes it's easy to assume that they're only going to come from one direction, but it's really possible that anyone could come and challenge materials and challenge intellectual freedom. A second source of threats is government officials and agencies, especially law enforcement. And this we mostly think about right now in terms of privacy threats. So that's why we got involved in USA Patriot Act activism and enacting a statute in Vermont to protect library user records. We always have a way to cooperate with law enforcement. We just require that they come with a court order or a search warrant, and that ensures that their request for information has been reviewed and vetted by an objective third party, and that the request isn't overbroad. So we are very careful in libraries to make sure we're not just giving away information to government agencies. A third source of threats that has received more attention in recent years is commercial entities, especially vendors of library resources and technologies. So initially, particularly around the time of the Patriot Act, we were very worried, of course, about the FBI, CIA, local law enforcement coming in and getting user information. But a more insidious and sometimes invisible threat comes from database vendors and companies that sell us products. So this can take many forms. Sometimes a vendor may offer you a free version of a database, but if that free version requires your library users to register, create a profile, assign a username and password in order to get into that database, then I would suggest that is not a free resource. The vendor is commodifying private patron data. If we as libraries decide to store information in the cloud, or if, as we do at UVM, we route our email reference questions through a third-party vendor, how do we know what's happening with those questions which are attached to a user? So this is an area in which we have to be careful. At UVM, for example, with our email, we have a signed written agreement with SpringShare, the vendor, that says we own that data about patrons. They may not do anything with it. They may not release it to law enforcement. They must keep it private. Now, a fourth source of threats to intellectual freedom are actually from the inside, right? Library employees and trustees. And this also can tend to be sort of a quiet, unseen form of censorship. If people responsible for buying the books are letting their own personal interests and bias play a big role in their selections, that's a problem. Or if they quietly take things off the shelf and store them in their office, that's a problem. Okay. I speak from time to time to library school students in courses, and a year ago I was a little surprised and concerned. I did an intellectual freedom presentation to a lovely group of library school students. And at the end, they had a Q&A session, and they were talking about what they would do if they identified a book in their collection that they thought was controversial, and they sort of agreed that it was controversial, and maybe we should warn the public about that. And they all agreed, well, a good idea would be to put a label on the book Warning, readers, if you pick up this book, this is what you're going to find inside. And they all seemed very satisfied with that solution. I found that a little shocking. The ALA back in the 1950s issued a statement on labeling and said, we do not do that. It's prejudicial and it's also impractical. If you're going to start labeling books, are you going to retrospectively read and evaluate every book on your shelf? Who's going to do that? What criteria will they use? So we have to be careful about threats that come from within as well. So given the importance of intellectual freedom, I would like to offer 5 recommendations for your consideration. The first of these is, I think it's really important that libraries have policies in place. We all know this, but in Vermont, where we're so decentralized and we have all of these standalone libraries, it's a lot of work to write policy. And maybe there's a way we could create boilerplate policies as a starting point so people don't have to start drafting from scratch. And perhaps this already exists. If I don't know about it, forgive me, but it seems like that might be a way to support. And these are 6 policies that ALA has determined are kind of essential for protecting intellectual freedom. Secondly, of course, this is not terribly innovative, but it's so important to provide continuing education and training for people who are going to be working with these issues. So library workers and trustees and board members, school administrators, but also we might want to think about our town managers and attorneys. Have we briefed them on the privacy law in Vermont that relates to libraries? Do they understand our stance on intellectual freedom? And could we have a conversation from time to time with the police and just remind them what we stand for, remind them that we're happy to comply with official court orders, but that is what we're going to require if they come looking for information. Third, I think it's important to make sure all library workers in Vermont know that there is ready access to just-in-time support and consultation. What could we say about what's available to the Department of Libraries in the way of support? I know that both of the associations in Vermont have intellectual freedom committees that will receive and receive questions and requests for help and will do their best to advise people. There's also the American Library Association Office for Intellectual Freedom, which is always eager to provide help and support. And I offered this as a last idea. Please be assured I receive no royalties on the Intellectual Freedom Manual, so I stand not to gain a bit if the book sells more copies. But I do think it is a really helpful resource. And wouldn't it be wonderful if every library in Vermont could have the Intellectual Freedom Manual there at the ready to consult? In fact, when I edited the Intellectual Freedom Manual 2 editions ago, I did some usability testing of the former edition, and I did it with librarians in Vermont, school libraries, public librarians, academic librarians, to determine how we could arrange the book to be ready and useful in a crisis. So it's full of checklists and advice and short essays on the law on different topics. So our hope is that it's very, very useful. Also, it would be really great if we could make sure that our libraries have adequate funding so they don't have to sell out. They don't have to compromise user privacy in exchange for access, so that we can afford to buy the version of the database, not just the free one. I think that's really important too. Also, sometimes if libraries aren't adequately staffed, they have to cut corners too. Some libraries institute self-service hold shelves where they put books on hold and they've got the patron names attached to them and they're out there for anybody to look at. That's not really okay. It's not okay for everybody to be able to review that shelf and see what their neighbors are reading. But sometimes librarians feel forced into those options because they just don't have the resources to do it in the best way. And lastly, there is an idea that some have been talking about over the last few years that maybe we should consider going back to amend our existing Vermont law to provide better protection for minors. Right now, minors under the age of 16 do not have very strong protection in our law. That was a compromise we had to make with the legislature in order to get the law passed at all. but we think it's important that that age be either removed or lowered. Many people in their teens need access to information without worrying that their parents are going to know about it. And also, we might consider doing something like California did, and that would be to be explicit about the obligations of third parties that handle user information. So if we are working with a vendor, maybe they could be subject to a term of law that says they must keep that information confidential and private and not share it. So I will stop sharing my screen now and rejoin you, and just close by saying, you know, libraries hold a unique and critically important place in the information landscape. I can think of no other information provider that does what we do. We provide a broad range of information. We make it accessible to everyone, regardless of means. And we do all this while protecting the privacy of library users rather than selling their personal information. I mean, who else does that? Nobody. So intellectual freedom is really our competitive advantage. And I believe it's essential that we work to protect that competitive advantage, both because it's the ethical thing to do and because it's a practical way to stay relevant. By protecting intellectual freedom, we are joining a great and long tradition of celebrating and nurturing the free inquiry that helps make us free. I'm so grateful for your time listening, and I welcome any questions that you have. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Trina. I'm ready to sign up for any class you teach. That was great and very approachable and very understandable for people who are new to this. I sort of wish I could immediately send a clip of this to all legislators and folks in municipalities. It really frames the conversation well. So thank you for that.
You're welcome. Thank you.
I want to open it up for the other members of the working group to ask questions or share what resonated with them from Trina's presentation. So working group members, please feel free always to come back on screen, show us your face, and raise your hand physically or with a little raise hand button. Kelly.
I just wanted to thank you, Trina, for that presentation. It was wonderful. And also the controversial label thing, they might actually see an increase in circulation if they had labeled books controversial. I know when I was a kid, if I saw that, it would be like snatching those off the shelf. So understand the premise and agree with it. But if you're having books that with low circ, that might actually help.
Thank you, Kelly.
It is interesting, the topic of the labels and then thinking about some of the recent discussions in academia around trigger warnings.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. I wonder, can you speak to that a little bit more? And how that.
Yeah, I think it really is concerning. And, you know, the ALA stance on labeling, like I said, we have the Library Bill of Rights, which is a very broad foundational statement, but the association every year is working to create what they call interpretations of the Library Bill of Rights, which are sort of, let's take this foundational principle and figure out how it plays out in real time with the current issues of the day. So it's so interesting to me that in the 50s, they wrote an interpretation on labeling, and that was the era of McCarthyism and communism. And so they wanted to label, people wanted to label books as being dangerous because they had ideas about communism in them. I have concerns about trigger warnings, just like I do about labeling. I don't know how we can possibly imagine all of the things that could be upsetting to individuals. There are many. I go through my day, I walk through the world, and I find certain things upsetting. It just is the way it is. But particularly in a library setting, labels, it just seems like a really impossible project, both theoretically and philosophically, but also practically. Like I said, are you going to read, who's going to read every book in the collection and determine how it gets labeled. It's an impossible project and one that should not even be considered, in my view.
Thanks. I'm reminded of a teen book that was titled something like A Book in Which No Dogs Die, which seemed really important at the time. They all kept dying. Maria Avery.
Hi, thank you. Thank you, Trina. I'll say for the record that Trina has personally taught me an immense amount at, during my time at UVM, both about just reference work in general, but particularly about privacy and intellectual freedom in ways that I never considered. So it is so wonderful that you're here with us today, Trina. And something that all of the speakers today, I don't know if I truly have a coherent thought and or question here, but something that I'm mulling over, thinking about defining or underlying all of these things in policy, and but also making sure that we're representing our communities in which that we serve. I'm wondering also in through it kind of a DEI and throwing in J that into that acronym here, about justice in academic or in intellectual freedom in our spaces too, because in DEI conversations, justice is such a huge component of this too. And I'm wondering how we strike that balance in centering people, identities, conversations, stories that have been historically unrepresented or underrepresented, while also facing these censorship challenges and affording this intellectual freedom to all. As you said, Trina, that these censorship issues or these challenges can come from any political background or ideology. So definitely not a coherent thought, but I am really pondering on how challenging it is to strike that balance, and maybe what some steps forward in that conversation could be.
It's so important that you raised that. I'm very glad you did. Yeah, because we are in a climate now, you're absolutely right, where we're seeing a lot of censorship attempts from what we might call the political right, but there also have been in Vermont recently, attempts to prevent attempts by social justice activists on the left to also curtail speech in libraries. And I think we have to be really careful about that. I think one way I think about it, Maria and others, is that there are two things going. We're operating libraries, and then we have library collections, and the two are not the same thing. So a library in its hiring practices, in the professional development programming it has, in the way that it treats people, it can be so attuned to all of the things you talked about. It can be attuned to DEI concerns, and it should be. The collection, what you have in the collection, though, is going to be diverse. You are going to have a variety of viewpoints. You're going to have people debating. In our collection at UVM, I love this example. There's a book, an academic, book written by PhDs called Sex at Dawn. And it's about human sexuality, in the beginning of our evolution as a species. Then there's also a book called Sex at Dusk, right? And it's another academic arguing the points. And so, we have to remember that many issues are not settled, and that it's important that the collection affords people the opportunity to see the conversation, debate that's going on. So our collections, our programming, and so forth should be diverse, and it should allow all kinds of points of view and some messy conversation. That does not mean we have to accept all kinds of bad behavior in terms of how we run the library or how we behave as employees or managers. So I think the two are a bit separate in that way, and that helps, I think.
feel like I have so many more things I have on my list of
I
things I want
know.
to talk with Trina
so
about. And
big.
we've hit the end of our time with Trina. Do you have just a quick question or comment, Jeanette?
No, that's okay. I'll pass.
Okay.
You can call me. I'm at UVM. Anyone, call me anytime. I'd be happy to chat about any of these issues.
Well, thank
And
you.
thank you again for having me.
Yeah.
Such an honor. And thank you for your hard work.
Just to say very quickly before we move to the next presenter, a couple of topics that just really strike me are that I want to be sure that we in the working group talk about this afternoon are the idea of the neutrality of the providing of information, and that there's sometimes a challenge there. And that really just emerged in my head, I think, when Trina talked about the difference between operations and the collections. And yet we also have the neutrality. And also the very last page of Trina's slide deck, the better protection for minors. Our current state statute calls out that library records are confidential with the exemption for custodial parents or guardians of patrons under age 16. And thinking about that in the context of the previous presenter, who spoke about the needs of LGBTQI plus youth, there's something there for us to pick up in the conversation later this afternoon as well, I think.
Yeah, I think 16 is way too high. And if there's going to be an age threshold at all, that feels way too high. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank
for
you
sharing
again.
that.
And
thank you so much for being with us and for your great presentation, Trina.
All my best to you and your work. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you. And now we're going to move right on to Joyce McIntosh, who is the Assistant Director of the Freedom to Read Foundation. And Joyce will explain, I believe, exactly what that group is, how it fits into some of the other key players in this space, and into the work of the American Library Association and the ALA's Office of Intellectual Freedom. Thank you, Joyce, for being with us. And I'm going to turn it over to you for the next 20 minutes, and then we'll come back for some Q&A.
Thank you. I am interested in how I get my slides to show up in the proper format when I am sharing them on.
They look good here. We're only seeing the book panel, the images of books on the left, and then Armed with Intellectual Freedom. They look purposeful and good.
So you're not
Yeah.
seeing all of the slides?
No,
Great.
I'm not.
Okay. Well, good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me. And just, I'm so thankful I got to hear some of Trina's presentation. Trina, I love your thoughtful responses. And it makes me mindful that I'll share a couple of additional notes on those fronts. I also noted in looking over your agenda and the work that you've done this year, you have the most active, effective working group. I appreciate the extensive work that you're doing and the deep dive that you're putting into every topic imaginable. So I'm really glad to be here. And on that note, I'm mindful that you're going to have lunch when I'm done, so I'm going to keep moving. All right, so I wanted to share just a couple of working definitions this morning so that we're all on the same page. When I think of intellectual freedom, I view it as the right of unrestricted access to information and ideas protected by the First Amendment. And for just a quick definition of censorship, an effort to ban, prohibit, remove, label, restrict, etc. library materials. And it sounds like Trina may have pointed this out. The fact that censorship isn't just removing a book from a collection, it can be preventing access to information. It can be making a decision to not purchase an item because you're nervous about having it. Censorship can come in many forms, and I want to just note and call out some of those various forms. All of you are probably familiar with this, but I always like to sort of share a refresher for myself as well, that we are a forum designated by the government. And when we create our library policies, our collection development policy, our reconsideration policy, we have to do those within local, state, and federal laws. And we have to do them in a way that we provide access to information and protect individuals, communities, and our own First Amendment rights. So public libraries are the only real limited public forum, but public libraries and public schools both still have to protect their patrons or students' First Amendment rights without government interference. And I want to remind everyone too that students don't lose their First Amendment rights when they walk in the door. Many court cases have backed that up. I'm not going to be an incredible downer and talk about this for 20 minutes, but I want to briefly address what is going on right now across the country. School and library boards are being targeted. We've gone from a case where someone, you might have one parent or one patron saying, I don't want Harry Potter in the library. It's witchcraft, it's a sin, et cetera, et cetera. And as librarians, we would have spoken with that one patron. We would have had a conversation about what we do and why our policies exist. But we've gone from that to a situation where we have challenges to 10, 20, 100 titles. And we've gone from that to hate groups becoming involved and First Amendment audits. And then finally, now we're at a national level where we have legislation, challenges brought against content in an entire state. What does that look like statistically? In 2019, things were on the rise at that point, 377 challenges. The pandemic, everything kind of went down a bit. People were focused on masking mandates, etc. Then in 2021, challenges again skyrocketed. The pandemic was over. Individuals turned to a different topic. And this past year, that number almost again doubled. And you can see the difference here. Like I said, it used to be, maybe you'd have a year and you'd have 300 titles, and then maybe you'd have 600 titles. By 2021, we were getting many, many titles. So each of those challenges may have been attached to, 10 books. 2022 is the highest we've seen. As I mentioned a moment ago, students don't lose their right when they walk in the school door. First Amendment rights of patrons and students are protected. And the reason I note this is because as we work with our trustees, our public library trustees and our school board trustees, it's important for them to recognize that they are also called to set aside their personal preferences and do the work they're meant to do. They're called to manage the funds, respect their fiduciary duty, do what's right for each patron or student, and uphold the ethics in a library. They're held to the same patron behavior policies. So sometimes right now when we have challenges at schools with school boards and someone comes up and, you know, a trustee may say, I don't like this, et cetera, et cetera. They may need to be reminded that their job is to protect that access to information and set aside their personal preference. I want to touch for a moment on the laws that protect us when a patron or a parent says this material's obscene or this is pornographic, and they're holding up one picture from one book. Many of us librarians are going, no, you have to read the whole thing. This is the law, the Miller test, that points to that. This is how a judge would define if material is legally, literally obscene. And what I like to remind people when they're doing that, when they're holding up that one page, is that our public and school librarians are trained. We are educated in how to read reviews, determine what's appropriate for our collection based on our patrons, our students in our community. And we've chosen those books with that education. We've properly cataloged them and we've put them in their proper spot. There is nothing that's going to be literally harmful to minors in our libraries. And then we can say, and points 2 and 3 of the Miller test say you have to read a document as a whole. So something to keep in mind when we're talking with people or defending content. Harmful to minors, same thing, but it will be adjusted for age appropriateness. And many of you are by now possibly familiar with your materials challenge form or your reconsideration form. Usually you'll have a spot on there that says, have you read, viewed, listened to the entire document? That's why. If a patron just says, no, I read page 3 and it had this picture, you don't really have a challenge form. Now, you don't crinkle it up and throw it away. It's good to be transparent. You know, hi, thank you for caring enough to submit this. I can't consider it unless the whole thing is filled out. And I see that you haven't looked at the whole material, etc. So I'm going to take about 5 minutes to just share where you can seek help if you are running into problems with challenges. I should note that the numbers in my slide a moment ago were huge. In Vermont, 6 people worked with the ALA Office for Intellectual Freedom last year with challenges. So Vermont is doing wonderfully. I'm so glad to be here with all of you, and it's clear that you are doing a wonderful job, and it's an awesome state. But if you do run into problems, I want to share where you can seek help, not only within ALA, but our affiliated organizations. And I know that you've already heard today, well, you've heard from Trina, you've heard from John from Every Library. And I just want to note that the information that I share as far as support, luckily, we're all working towards the same goal. And you'll hear something different from me versus John versus Pen America versus the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund versus the National Council of Teachers of English. We're all here to help. Sometimes it looks a bit different. For example, the American Library Association is a nonpartisan organization. We represent all librarians from all forms of library throughout the United States. Therefore, we have to manage our funding in a way that protects our status. And we may do things differently sometimes than every library or other groups. So my goal here for the next few minutes is to share how and when to reach out to us and the affiliated groups that I work with. So first off, the ALA Office for Intellectual Freedom is the place to pick up the phone and call for challenge support. Please report challenges on our website. A challenge doesn't mean they've filled out an official form or they've removed the book or are attempting to remove a book. A challenge could look like a First Amendment audit. It could look like that parent holding up a book in a meeting and telling the school board, I want all the gay books out, or please report that, because then we understand what's taking place and where it's taking place, and we're glad to follow up. We'll know what's going on if we get a call. ALA will make statements and letters of support. We always work with state leaders first. Sometimes people don't want a large organization swooping into their community because they control their community. So in those instances, we're happy to help a local group, a local ACLU attorney, the state library intellectual freedom committee members. We're happy to help in writing a letter of support. The Merit Humanitarian Fund, I'll note in a minute, as well as FTRF. So the Office for Intellectual Freedom does confidential support. We will never say, oh, I talked to someone last week about this. We're here for you. And if you need to send that via Gmail, via private email, pick up the phone and call us, please do. We understand you may not want to be FOIA'd in the workplace. We do trend spotting, advocacy, public awareness, Banned Books Week initiatives. Banned Books Week is made up of a large coalition. And we got feedback last year that for a number of people, they weren't allowed to have Banned Books Week exhibits. It was deemed controversial. So this year, the coalition will be releasing graphics in a theme that focus more on the freedom to read and less on the label of banned books. All right, so I work directly with the Freedom to Read Foundation and OIF. The key that's different is the Freedom to Read Foundation, as a separate nonprofit, does First Amendment education, litigation, and advocacy. Litigation is the main separating word there. ALA cannot be involved in litigation. The Freedom to Read Foundation can. And because of our First Amendment focus, sometimes we can make a more bold statement on behalf of the First Amendment. Unite Against Book Bans was created 1 year ago. This is a wonderful initiative. So often as librarians, we can't be the people out there advocating for ourselves. Perhaps our job is being threatened. This is a vehicle for community members and students. And if you have positive, progressive church leaders, anybody in the community can pull up Unite Against Book Bans. There's a challenge toolkit. It gives you ways to organize and advocate. And this is wonderful because the statistics that are shared are nonpartisan, and that's demonstrated in them. You really can talk to people across any aisle with these statistics and talking points. Excuse me. Here are just a few of the talking points that are shared. And I really like these because there's a sort of thing that a parent could get up at a school board meeting and safely say without really feeling that they're sticking their neck out. So I encourage you to take a look at that website. The ALA Policy Core, this has been around for a while, but now, as I mentioned, challenges have gone to a legislative level, and the members of ALA Policy Core are working and doing advocacy at that level. They're trained in press relations, how to speak to your representatives, etc. So this is a wonderful group. Keep an eye on them. I'm so thankful for Policy Core and the energy that they are putting in. So if you're ever interested in finding out more, having a speaker from Policy Core, a training with Policy Core, or Unite Against Book Bans, please do reach out. I'm going to mention the Merit Fund, and I hope none of you ever need the Merit Fund. It exists for librarians and library staff who have either faced discrimination in the workplace or who are their job is being threatened because of their defense of intellectual freedom. You would apply online. It's a short application. Usually people will use funding to retain an attorney, or to cover 1 month's housing fees, or an insurance costs that they can't afford because they are losing their job, etc. So keep that in mind if you know anyone that needs that. And on that note, I want to mention too, just a second, I will stop sharing. There we go. I wanted to mention also that Trina was talking about, and Sarah, I think, had the question about that intersection of social justice and intellectual freedom. And last summer, the Freedom to Read Foundation held a symposium about those topics. And one thing that came out of it was a need to see more and explore that more. And the Journal of Intellectual Freedom and Privacy that came out a few days ago is the results of that symposium. You may want to take a look at that. And also, in regards to those questions, I didn't put up the Library Bill of Rights or the ALA Code of Ethics on the screen. But I feel like as librarians, especially as we're involved in intellectual freedom, we walk a bit of that tightrope. The ALA Code of Ethics calls us to basically be good social justice advocates. In other words, we work for equity, we work for inclusion. Everyone is welcome in the library. And at the same time, the Library Bill of Rights says we will offer information covering all points of view or perspectives on current and historical content. So I acknowledge that intellectual freedom often feels very gray, and we are sometimes on a tightrope. But it's clear based on your statistics and from what I've seen of your working group that things are going well in your state on that front. So thank you for what you're doing, and please let me know what questions you have.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Okay, working group members, please feel free to come back on camera and put your hands up physically or virtually to ask Joyce any follow-up questions you might have.
I feel like that's the 90 miles an hour intellectual freedom overview, but I welcome whatever you want to know.
I found it really helpful to hear the difference in the roles between organizations. Sometimes it will seem like there are quite a lot of players in a space, but then kind of hearing more about what each does and the parameters within which the different groups operate was really helpful for me.
Good. Good. And we can certainly help to get you from one to the other. Always feel free to reach out to the ALA Office for Intellectual Freedom. And if it makes more sense to connect you with someone who can do community organizing through Unite Against Book Bans, then that's what we'll do. We literally work next to each other in cubes.
Oh, wow. So it's that proximal.
We are, yes, we are that close.
One thing that was really nice, I thought, to hear, and Joyce and I jumped on a call yesterday to connect before she came today, and so I found that was really helpful, Joyce, that you took that time. For me, it felt a little bit reassuring to hear that there are these challenges that are coming up, but typically the ultimate response is that the courts are finding in favor of the rights to the materials that have been challenged. Can you talk a little bit more about that with us? Because I think for me, I see the gloom and doom, and I even include these news stories in my weekly report sometimes to the Agency of Administration. And I know that, this is something that people wonder, will this come to our state? But to hear six cases here, and then to also hear about, just to have a little bit more reassurance maybe on how these legal cases tend to play out, might be helpful for people.
Yeah, so first thing to bear in mind is that within the First Amendment, we have the ability as limited public forums and public schools to create policies. And once those are in place, we must follow them. And judges acknowledge that. Do you have a policy? Did you follow it? Right now, groups are saying, I'm going to take the librarian to court. I'm going to take the teacher to court because they're giving us obscenity or they're giving us pornography, et cetera, et cetera. No judge has gone down that road. What we see coming out of the courts is a judge looks at those cases and they're saying, okay, first off, does this material meet that criteria? Is it, material that's not protected under the Constitution? And again, our librarians are not, even if they send in the police to search for pornography in the librarians are coming out, and the school librarians are coming out of this with judges say no. One, they're protected. They're doing what they have to do. And two, the material isn't obscene, harmful to minors, or child porn. It's, we're basically, the judges at this point are being supportive. In Llano, Texas, a couple weeks ago, in a case there, a judge ordered that books be returned to the library, that they be available during reconsideration, and that they be added back into the catalog. So right now we're on a good trajectory on that front. And so quite often in support, I'm reminding people to find support, understand who in your community is supportive, who in your personal life is supportive, who can advocate with you or on your behalf. And then, do you have policies in place? Are you following the policies? And quite often with trustees, we're talking about meetings. I see someone has a question. Go ahead.
Hi, yeah, this is great and gives me some more optimism. Although I noticed that there is a bit of a ramp up happening, and there's less challenging of individual books or groups of books as the occasional effort to go after a library's entire budget or existence. And that did in fact happen in at least one library in Vermont in the last couple of months, where a town meeting day budget vote went against the library because of book challenge issues. the library will stay open. It's just one portion of their budget, but still every dollar counts. And I wonder if you can speak to that sort of escalation as well.
Yeah, that sort of escalation, well, yes, it's alarming. We are seeing a lot more attempts at viewpoint discrimination, which is also not legal, and a judge would call out viewpoint discrimination, where people will say, I don't want any of those woke anti-racist books, or I don't want books about people of color, or I don't want any LGBTQ content, no sex content. So there's absolutely that ramping up. And we're also seeing more large organized groups like mass resistance, etc., becoming involved. That's where Unite Against Book Bans has been critical next step, because Unite Against Book Bans can focus on helping communities organize against that form of attack. So while I tend to be working with librarians one-on-one, this is how to get through a challenge. When that starts happening, that's when we're involving Unite Against Book Bans staff. Often we're involving, you're involving local police, local law enforcement, and in the case of bomb threats, First Amendment audits on a large scale, etc., we're involving national law enforcement and FBI, etc. So I don't know if that answered your question, but it is ramping up, and that's how we're looking at it and addressing it.
Thank you so much, Joyce. I really appreciate your being with us here today and you're taking the time